Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Strip by Sia, your podcast for strippers, sex workers, and all the fancy naked people in between. I am your host, Steph Sia, aka Kimchi on stage. I am a stripper based here in Vancouver, Canada. I am also a former sugar baby, and I'm also a digital content creator. So I have an OnlyFans, I do online work, custom videos, etc. I have created this podcast about 2 years ago, and I'm interviewing different sex workers or people that are within our organization or people within our community that support us, and basically with the aim to destigmatize sex work. And I'm not going to ramble on too much today because I have a very, very quick, tight hour with our exciting guest all the way from the UK. I am bringing on Dr. Raven Bowen onto the show today to speak about duality, to speak about sex work, Brexit, the UK versus Canada, everything. We have an hour, and I don't know how we're going to get through it all, but we're going to try to. So, Dr. Raven Bowen, are you there?
I am here. Please call me Raven.
Okay.
Excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you, and thank you so much for coming onto the show today. I have so many questions for you, and we're going to try to just get through it all because we're like, whoa, that's a lot. This is going to be more than an hour, but we're just going to try to do our best in terms of tackling it all. But basically, you are the current CEO of National Ugly Mugs based in the UK. You were also serving as the executive director at PACE, which was on a couple episodes ago. And you do a lot of research, a lot of work in sex work, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, 27 years of research? What's the number?
It has been, it's been quite a few years. I walked into PACE in 1995. Wow. So yeah, it's, I deny my government age. I always pretend I'm at least 10 years younger, but actually, no, it's been quite a long time and a long journey. And surprisingly, things are so cyclical because you keep revisiting the same issues because we're not fully addressing the core root causes of things. So everything seems like it's coming round and round again, which is the frustrating thing about being around so long. But there is progress. There has been progress. So.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you have done an extensive amount of research, and I know you by way of Dr. Tamara O'Doherty, who I went to SFU with, and she's on the show. I was guest lecturing at her class and everything, and she's an amazing human being. Go listen to her episode if you haven't already.
Yeah, Tamara is one of my mentors. We spent a lot of time organizing together. She was with PACE for some time. Also worked on Pivot and some other adjacent strategies around human trafficking. So yeah, she's amazing. When she calls, you respond. So I'm really glad that you had a chance to have exposure to her. She's absolutely a brilliant human being.
She's wonderful, but we're not going to be talking about her today. We're going to be speaking all about you. We're speaking about you, your work, your career, the book that you've just written as well, which we're going to get into in much more detail later on today. But where did you want to start? I mean, chronologically.
Yeah, I guess, oh gosh, you don't want to talk about that. But I could just maybe talk about some of the organizing that started in Vancouver, because I did start my career as a practitioner in Vancouver doing outreach and support to street-based workers primarily. We were situated in Mount Pleasant at the time, so wow. Mount Pleasant, downtown East Side, yes. And then we had a couple of locations. We partnered with Vandu Area Network Drug Users. We've done a whole bunch of things around decrim, safety, support, confronting violent predators, lots of partnerships with police and other organizations over the years, and it's really great to see that how PACE has evolved, but still remains grounded in some of the core principles that many of us, kind of dug the ground for to make it happen. And there are lots of individuals that contributed so after that, but concurrently, I was at PACE for 12 years, but I was concurrently involved in the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities. And so that was a group that was more around policy advocacy, and we supported and negotiated a lot of research projects, and Living in Community was one of those that was launched through some of our involvement, and the MAP ban, and there's all kinds of things that came about through that work, a lot of international harm reduction involvement. We did a lot of reports, just focusing on all of the issues that we found in Vancouver around violence and safety and, just inclusion and respect and recognition of the lives of sex workers, and trying to fight against some of the displacement and criminalization and just sheer disrespect that this population was suffering, and particularly among, Indigenous populations and people of color, and impoverished populations, and women and trans and men in sex work. We helped launch the BC Coalition of Experiential Men that then evolved into Hustle, and then they're now situated with the Health Initiative for Men. So there's like a lot of little budding things that I was involved in, but I was not alone. I was involved with quite a large community of folks that spread out and did their own thing, and then just grew the movement in the ways that they could based on what their priorities were. So it was a fun time in organizing in the 90s and early 2000s, but really a difficult time because, we had serial predators on the loose, we had serial killers on the loose, we had a lot going on, and unfortunately those conditions still persist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know you mentioned like, I listened to the episode of Pace and stuff too, and like you were mentioning, this is off the air, but like how much things have changed, but also things have kind of stayed the same as well. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think because Pace is primarily a by and for organization, they stay grounded in that. There are times when those sorts of messages and those kinds of initiatives get co-opted by other populations and other groups, and I think that Pace has managed to stay sort of authentic to that.
Yeah,
they're serving a range of populations, but I think that essentially one, Pace surviving through all of the ups and downs that it's been through. It started in an apartment, as I said, with Beach Latin, but then there were times when Pace was homeless, when we were operating out of a house or an apartment or something, like, the things that people sacrifice to keep our organization going. And unfortunately, some of the people who've contributed the most are no longer with us.
Right.
But, I think that for Pace existing as long as it has and still being meaningful, and still, I think the woman in the episode described it as her dream job, and that makes me just makes me smile.
Yeah, for sure.
As long as it's somebody's dream job, and then the work, the sacrifice was all worth it.
Definitely. I mean, and this was just considering this was all your work just based in Vancouver in Canada. How did you get yourself over to the UK? Was it research that led you there? Was it an opportunity? Or how did you find yourself in the UK?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, because I was born in the UK, actually. I was born in London, but I'm a dual citizen.
There we go.
And I thought, at some point, when I ever grew up, I would move to the UK and explore what that is. My dad served in the military and the police force, and he'd always talk a lot about going back to England and experiencing that. So I had the opportunity I went back to school mid-career. There was one point when I was pretty much fed up. I decided to do my undergrad and then do my master's as protest degrees, really. Because there's just some limit sometimes to the advocacy you can do when you don't have credentials, unfortunately. Right. So I thought, okay, I'm going to get your damn credentials then. So I went over to the UK. I won an international scholarship to do my PhD with this wonderful woman named Professor Maggie O'Neill when she was at she was at Durham at the time. Okay. And then later we finished at York. We moved to York, but. So it was a little bit of personal and a little bit of research, and that drove me to go to the UK. And I just thought I have to seize the opportunity to see my birthplace, and also to explore what sex work is like in that context, and explore this topic of duality specifically in a country that is 40 times smaller than Canada, but has twice our population. Yeah. So, it was an opportunity to explore how that manifests.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And like from there, correct me if I'm wrong, you then started working at National Ugly Mugs.
Yeah.
how did that happen?
So at the tail end of my PhD, there was like the CEO job at NUM was posted twice while I was in the UK.
Okay.
And the first time I looked at it, I was like, oh, okay, I think it was like 2017. I looked at it, I'm like, nah, I'm busy. I was on the board of ScotPep. We were trying to do the decrim bill for Scotland, and there was like lots of that we had on the go. And I thought, okay, well, that seems like a really neat opportunity, but I can't go for it now. And then it came up again in 2018. So I thought, like it seems the role kind of coalesces a number of things in terms of advocacy, research, needs for trying to work around violence prevention. It sort of ticked a lot of boxes for me in terms, because I didn't want to go do the PhD and then go into academics necessarily, because I don't consider myself like a career academic, right?
Okay.
I saw this as like a vehicle,
right,
to come back to affect change. So as a practitioner, so it seemed to have that perfect blend of the academics, the activism, and the service delivery to change conditions for people. So I thought, oh my God! So I competed for it and then ended up winning the role in late 2018.
Amazing. And can you tell the audience a little bit about NUM as well? Just because we actually do have quite a bit of UK listeners too, so I'm sure they would love to hear about that.
Great, sure. And one of the things that appealed to me about NUM was it was narrower in scope than PACE. PACE does everything.
They do everything.
NUM,
yes.
Yeah, NUM focuses on providing victim support, survivor support to adults who've been harmed in sex industries. So we have a national reporting and alerting mechanism where sex workers and others document those who are perpetrating harms against sex workers. We process those reports, and then we share them in the form of alerts for people to avoid dangerous people and conditions.
Oh, interesting.
And then we have, so that's then it's like digitized. So it's because before in the UK and in other countries, you see that there are these sort of isolated, quote unquote, bad date lists that they used to be called, but dangerous persons lists.
Right.
But this is a way of creating a national one so that offenders can't just move from one place to another and start offending, and there's no tracking.
Yes,
so
really
we're
cool.
the sort of centralized mechanism for that. And then we also provide like casework victim support, like individualized support for survivors of harm. And then we support them to seek justice and healing. So that could be in the criminal justice system or criminal legal system, but mostly outside of it. And for healing and recovery and all that stuff. And then we work to prevention and community education and advocacy and all the things that come alongside the service delivery. And we have access to quite a bit of data on victimization, and because we hire sex workers on staff as well. That's the other thing.
Amazing.
Where this is not a rescue organization. We are primarily by and for in the ways that are most important in terms of service delivery and strategic direction of the organization and all that. So we do research that's led by sex workers that are based on the things that they're seeing and trends and data, things they want to respond to. But that element is new, so we've only implemented that in the last couple of years. But I know that I couldn't run an organization without sex workers around.
For sure.
Active and former, because that's how you know what the priorities are. That's how you can direct and run an organization and be effective. So we're working in a space that has challenging politics. That there's a huge move, and you've seen that in Canada, where there's this movement around criminalizing and around ending demand as a way. Somehow they have logic that states that, some people believe that ending demand means women will be safe, sex workers will be safe, and everything will be roses. And those of us who kind of weigh facts and are interested in sort of research recognize that that's not
not the
necessarily
case.
The approach to deal with harms against sex workers or to deal with violence and gender-based violence. So there are those toxic policy environments and political environments that exist in both Canada and the US and the UK.
In the UK,
and the US.
That too, let's not forget about them.
Leave them out.
Wow.
But it's always like negotiating for safety of sex workers. You'd think that no matter what the politics, safety would be a priority, but actually it's not necessarily the case. Like the people who are not in favor, or people who are in favor of criminalization, don't necessarily jump on board for our safety agenda, which is quite surprising.
Yeah, and it's really sad to see that as well. Like, with your research primarily in Canada and the UK, do you see any like really obvious similarities or really obvious differences with your research? I mean, it's a really broad question.
Because Canada's huge and the UK's huge and very diverse, right? So I think that there are pockets of very progressive politics. I think Vancouver in particular has had a unique history around, violence against sex workers. So the policies and the strategies and practices in place in Vancouver aren't necessarily true in other parts of Canada, and would also not mirror anything that you could see in the UK.
Right.
I think that, some of the community safety strategies are not necessarily hearing from sex working communities about their unique harms and their unique vulnerabilities. So a lot of these strategies in both countries are implemented without that voice.
Right.
And there, as we were saying before, there's this move to like this sort of moral agenda to eliminate sex industries and eliminate the sale of sex.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
And all of those manifestations. So, some people see that as a worthwhile pursuit. Some people think that sex is part of our society. Consuming adult content should be something that free adults are allowed to do.
Right.
But the people who provide that content, provide those services, should be free of exploitation, should have choices, should not be in survival situations, etc. So I'm more of the latter camp around freer society where people can choose the kind of work and not necessarily criminalize people for legal activities, but to support industries in regulating and managing their own risk.
Yeah.
I think that strategic involvement from police and the state and how we choose to regulate is important, but has to be guided by the people who are working in those industries.
Of course. You have to incorporate the people that you're going to be governing. It's just, I feel like that's common sense, no?
Yeah, it is, but not, I think that if some people are defining sex workers as vulnerable adults, then they feel they have the right to speak for workers, and not necessarily hear what their needs are and to move in the direction that serves the interests of sex workers. There is, I think, less of an interest in doing that and more of an interest in eliminating what people might deem as immoral activity.
Right. Okay. Let's move on. I would have so many more questions on that, but we have to start talking about the book.
This is like the first opportunity I've had to speak to an industry expert about the book. So I would love to hear what popped for you and what impressions you got as well.
Absolutely. So the book we're talking about here, Raven wrote Work, Money, and Duality. Oh, there we go. She's showing me a picture. Work, Money, and Duality, Trading Sex as a Side Hustle. And I thought this was really interesting because honestly, it really rang true for me because as a person that practices duality, that has a square job and practices sex work, say, on the side, it really, I resonated with it a lot. And it was really interesting, a lot of the research that you were doing and the perspectives that you're writing on. I know I mentioned it to you before we started recording, but even just, the separation that, language can cause, the differences of, the racism that happens in the UK, what that looks like, who they target, also, the mobility as well. I thought those pieces were really interesting to me and things that I had never really thought about. But then again, I'm also here in Canada too, so it's really, really interesting. It was a good read. It's available now, I think. No,
say again?
Is it available now in Canada or?
Yeah, it's available in Canada. Amazon sells it, I think, but you can get it from Policy Press. You can get it from the publishers.
There you go.
I can give your community a discount code for it. But so yeah, that thing about duality is like I interviewed people who were blending sex work and square jobs, and some were doing it, as a means to exit into or transition into mainstream square work or mainstream sex work. So they were seeing it as more of a transition hustle.
Right.
But then some individuals were, trying to pay off like debts or trying to, had a project in mind. So they had an end date in mind. So they said they're going to blend these two jobs in these really, diverse industries in order to get on the property ladder or to achieve some particular thing.
Right.
And then there were the population of folks who just decided that they don't ever want to be poor, that they want to supplement jobs in either industry forever, so that they'll always have that versatility and that flexibility, because, relying on one job meant like a form of slavery for them.
Yes.
So it's like you feel quite trapped, right? If
Totally.
you're a wage slave and you have one source of income, you really feel that you don't have the flexibility to even sometimes prioritize your health and safety. And that's in sex work and in square industry. So Duality
100%.
provided what we call flex security.
Yes.
So it provided like that income and the security and the flexibility to do the kinds of things you want to do in life without feeling trapped in one form of employment or another, particularly with low-paying jobs.
Yes.
Where, or your service industry jobs, right? So where you just do so much emotional labor in whether that service industry role is in sex work or square industries. And some of the folks who were the most stressed out were the ones who were, or their square job was also in the service industry.
Yeah.
And so that was quite a lot for them. But yeah, it was just mapping the practices in that intersection of sex work and square work, because most of the research and most studies don't even talk about this population. Like they bypass, they either talk about it as like this chaotic people flipping in between employment and not having stability, but they don't talk about it as a strategic way to involve yourself in work.
Yeah.
As a strategic way to work. It's always painted as quite chaotic.
Yeah, and I really, really enjoyed that because, as you mentioned, like I have never heard of any formal research doing anything on this, or even I was never able to connect with anyone in my community that I know had a vanilla job and also was doing sex work. In fact, like the sex worker groups that I am in, I actually got flack for doing that, and I got attacked for taking up space because I didn't do as much sex work as my peers. And
yes, that is something that I didn't get into in the book, and I would, if I'm ever able to do a larger study, I want to do that, because there's phrases like specifically for people, they call they're derogatory phrases. You hear that, you hear things like hobby ho and things like that for people who aren't fully in the game, and that whole saying that there ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Like, there's a belief that either you're in it and you're not. Or you're not. So you're not seen as really fully a sex worker or really fully. So there is that lateral oppression that happens, and that's something that I think there needs to be more investigation of.
Absolutely.
But it is that, it's a ways that we always find to set ourselves apart better than other populations, but that it's for dancers. I mean, you think that's more of the norm, that they're doing something else on the side. Of course they are. Like most people are doing side hustles.
Yeah. Especially in Vancouver to like survive. Yeah. I mean, like it just kind of made me curl back into my shell a little bit too, and I felt like I could never really talk about it or really express, because they're like, I felt like I needed to validate the type of work that I did, and I had to be like, well, I've done this for X amount of years, but at the same time, I feel like I shouldn't have to prove myself to anyone, to like prove the sex work that I do. I'm in this community. I've been in this community, but I also, as like the book suggested, like I like to be comfortable. I like to have some security when it comes to my income. And like when I compare the money I get from sex work to my vanilla job, it's like, okay, well, I can make this in a couple days or work a month, like, and slave away behind my desk, behind my laptop. So
I think that, for sex workers who, like, I think that there's an opportunity for sex workers to embrace the diversity that is the industry, and that includes people who are dabbling, people who are in it for just exploring their sexuality, and then people who are in it like hardcore. Like there's incredible diversity across the types of work and the market and the populations, and unfortunately it just seems like that's a hangover from mainstream industries or from other ways that we tend to oppress each other or judge each other. But for sex workers who live dual lives, they feel like that's the best way to be a sex worker, because they're not burned out necessarily if they're overwhelmed by all of the the work involved in nurturing clientele or providing services to clientele, or they can take the breaks that they need to stay healthy and to not have to rely on sex work full time, because they felt that was the worst way to be involved in sex industries. Just like anything else, if you have a job flipping burgers and that's your only source of income, if you're exploited in that role, that's gonna be quite damaging. And then you have no escape from it. But the ways that they were working, they could take breaks, they could be more selective about who they saw, they could also take breaks and control the level of work they do in square jobs, and it just gave them a lot of freedom and flexibility that they wouldn't find anywhere else necessarily. So
definitely. I wanted to go back on your point about like oppression in our own community, and like going more into the topic of whorearchy, because I had mentioned this to Tamara, and she's like, you have to speak to Raven, she's like the perfect person to speak about whorearchy. Did you want to, because there's so many different kinds of whorearchy too. I mean, we could start off with the pyramid, and that was something that I had used in my guest lecture in her class, and she's like, oh, this is a perfect example like for you to speak to Raven about. But the notion of whorearchy in terms of like the pyramid, and I guess the ones that I'm really familiar with would be the pyramid with cam girls at the top, and it goes down to say maybe strippers. Oh, sorry.
I'm thinking, is that Tilly? Is that
it was mentioned
Tilly
in the
Wallace's?
Yeah, I think it was that one that you mentioned in the book. And then like with full service sex workers being at the bottom of the pyramid, I definitely see this a lot within my own circles too, which makes me really sad, because again, like I really feel like there shouldn't be any kind of judgment on the type of sex work that you do. We all do sex work. But did you want to speak a little bit about, where that is drawn from, where that comes from?
Yeah, I think like Tilly and others who, because the thing about whorearchy is that sex workers have been talking about it for a long time, which is really great. And and then you see it in research sporadically, maybe not by that name as whorearchy, but you see it around where they talk about stratification, and they talk about race, they talk about language, they talk about jobs that are seen as like non-contact cleaner jobs, like webcamming versus full-service sex work, which is seen as dirtier, street-based work, on and off street. Like there's so many dichotomies and divisions, and it also seems to be very context-specific too. And there are so many hierarchies, because if you look even within cultural communities, like I remember in Vancouver, the Canadian-born Chinese were at the top of that, right? And so in the UK, the white British are at the top of the, but then depending on what work they do, they wouldn't necessarily be at the very top. Like if they're white British, but a street-based worker, that has a lot of interference, but a lot of police have a lot of intervention in their lives. Then they wouldn't be at the very top of that, hierarchy, because there are the types of work, how you do it, when you do it, who you are, all of those things play into what kind of status you would have in the industry, how much you can charge, how you're able to sort of market yourself, what prices you can command, and also third parties who manage industries, not the subcontractors, but the folks who decide who's on shift, what images they're going to portray and advertise as part of their services, they also play a part in deciding who's valuable and who isn't.
Right.
But all of that is nested in our culture. What the same people who we are celebrated as beautiful are the same ones who are going to do quite well in sex industries, right? And so and sexuality plays in there, health plays in there. There's so much ability, like there's so much going on in those hierarchies that I think we need to do a full unpacking of that, but just to recognize how fluid, how influenced they are, and how diverse they would be across any sector or any environment that the industry is operating within.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I mean, even the point that you talked about, like, even with the marketing, that dictates, like,
what's valuable, what's valuable. And a lot of times in our society, we're told what to buy, what to wear, what looks good, and so those folks who craft those messages are very much whatever their preferences are will be translated in what they choose to promote. But then it's also what the market will pay for versus what the market will not pay for. So you as a woman of color as well as me, it's like we know that there are certain looks or certain stereotypes that would be marketable and certain stereotypes about our cultures that we would move away from, so there are lots of ways that those who kind of construct the industry and help perpetuate stereotypes, they play to what's most marketable.
Right. That's really interesting.
And the other hierarchy was sugar babies were on top, right?
Yes, I saw that one too, which is interesting. Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that one
mainstream
too?
dating. I think that was the argument, was that it mirrors mainstream dating the most. The idea is that people who sugar don't provide sexual services necessarily. They just go on dates, and they're like escorts. They're just going on dates, meeting people, going to the theater, and then being paid or whatever. That you can see how that would be seen as more sanitized as compared to someone who's providing full service in a street-based environment, for example.
Right. I thought that was really interesting. I mean, as a former sugar baby, I thought, I was like, oh, I've never seen it that way. That it was like, I guess more like deemed socially acceptable, but also like sugaring is so glamorized as well, and like I guess maybe more known in like mainstream media, and it just seems like this glamorous life. And I mean, at some points, yes, it was pretty glamorous, but I like conversations that I hear within my sex worker groups, they're like, oh, sugaring is just like escorting, but like way cheaper and with more emotional labor is what I keep
But
hearing.
did you identify as a sex worker when you were sugaring?
See, I didn't. Not, right? I did not. Yeah. I didn't even know that was sex work to me, because I was separating that.
And that's the thing, like even dancers and performers, because it's adult industries, but they don't necessarily identify as sex workers, and they have the choice not to. And there's a tendency, in order to avoid stigma, that we just steer away from things that are not to our benefit. But people have the right to choose how they identify, and within that, they can distance themselves from more problematic aspects of the industries that they're in. But it is that, like, not everyone will identify as a sex worker, as you know, and we know very well.
Yes.
But that, dancers, there were rifts between dancers and high-end street workers and, sex workers, escorts, and who's sugaring, who isn't, and there would be all of these infighting that happens between these populations.
Yes.
So it's interesting that you, as a dancer, if someone called you a sex worker, would you identify with that?
Now I would.
No.
Two years ago, I didn't. And that's even evident in my intro, too. Strip by Sia, your podcast for strippers, sex workers, and all the fancy naked people. Because I had some people be like, oh, strippers aren't sex workers. And I'm like, well, it's how you choose to identify yourself. But I think, for me personally, as an umbrella, I think it is part of it. That's my own opinion.
I think the definitions need to be worked out by the people in the industries, like yourself, because sometimes as a practitioner or a researcher, I would say adult industries, or I would say sex industries, but then there are people who don't feel that they're part of those industries, or do, like burlesque dancers. Sometimes they feel they're part of the industry. Sometimes I hear that they define themselves as not being part of the industry, but they're very mainstreamed part of the industry. So we did a fundraiser with this Burlesque at Home group that, saw themselves as part of the industry, and because maybe they're seen as more respectable, they thought it was their opportunity to raise funds and attention to the issues faced by sex workers who didn't enjoy the privilege that they enjoyed. So it would be a really great exercise to get some clarity around the definition, so we're not I don't want to insult anyone.
No, me neither.
But I also want to get rid of whore stigma and sex work stigma too, because I think that the legal work you do in any community, any environment, shouldn't be stigmatized, whether you're a grave digger or involved in sex industries. Like your work shouldn't be tainted. So I want to work against that, but I also don't want to offend people who don't identify as sex workers but may identify as adult industry workers or adult content creators or whatever. You know. So do one of those definition things.
I should. That could be its own episode, honestly.
And the language is power, because as we see in our sex worker rights movement, so many, our umbrella's been co-opted and hijacked, and so much of the language is co-opted and hijacked, and so if we can come up with definitions that are respectful of the diversity within the industry, so that those of us who are allies can speak about the industry in respectful ways, that would be perfect.
Absolutely. So great. Okay, there's so much here too. I kind of wanted to go and do a side tangent on your piece about Brexit as well. I thought that was really interesting in reading about the privilege in being white, but like white British, and the racism that was against like other races, I guess like primarily like Eastern Europeans. I remember one of the participants in your book, she was British, but then she looked like she might not be, I guess, quote unquote, like white. And one of her clients was like, "Oh, you're very like white for a foreigner," or something like that. And
she was a white migrant, so she wasn't British by birth. Yeah,
gotcha.
But she was the right kind of migrant, right?
The right kind,
the right kind, or the white kinds. But in that context, because we were leaving the EU and there were lots of public sentiment around, there were some falsehoods around, immigration and migration and Europeans being in the UK economy. And, there's a lot of polarization in the community about whether we should remain in the EU, whether we should leave. And because my dad's recollection was done around that time and afterwards, the sex workers who I was speaking with were impacted by whether we left the EU or not, but also they were seeing how there was a preference among their clientele for white British and the closest thing to white British, and if you can perform whiteness and be able to define yourself as white British, you would do quite well. And there were ways that was coded within the advertisement and the communications with clients, but then people who were white workers in their own context would normally be on the upper end of the hierarchy, but because they were sort of constructed out of whiteness in ways that they wouldn't have been in their home communities in the UK at that time, because there was that Eastern Europeans were were vilified and were seen as a drain on the UK economy. And there's a lot, if you go back during and see some of the media and the ways that populations of Europeans were being spoken about and Romanians were being spoken about, it's horrific. And even in the UK, the targeting of migrant sex workers and Eastern European sex workers and the deportation, it's crimmigration that happens with this population. There's an extreme targeting of that group. So we saw that in how sex workers who were living dual lives, how they were marketing, how they were engaging with clients, but then also how Brexit itself was affecting their sex industry work and their square jobs. And then people don't normally think of like sex workers as part of the working population or part of the working class. But, so including what they felt about sex work and Brexit was important, because they're just not a population that would normally be thought about when we think about these geopolitical decisions and these big changes and these macro level changes that affect our economy. Sex workers are affected by the economy like anyone else, and usually affected quite immediately, as we saw with the COVID pandemic, when there's no specific support to sex workers, and then they become destitute overnight because of the nature of their businesses and the nature of their work, and particularly people who are involved in survival work, where, you know, or in those conditions of survival where they were, you know, in desperate need of support, and any change to the economic system affects them most directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that piece was really, really interesting too, because there were so many components to it, like in terms of just like language, the preference to speak English, the ability to move around and work across the EU, and the racism that happens within those communities. It was really an interesting read. So thanks for that research, because I would have never like come across this in my day-to-day without it. I also want to just, I know there's like only like 15 minutes left or something, but I was like, I also want to speak about like the notion of secrecy and anonymity, and how that was being used, especially for workers that practice duality. It was really cool to read about, you know, the different types of secrecy and like secret keeping, and how exhausting that can be, you know, trying to keep up with this lie and that lie, and
and all to avoid stigma or to avoid harm on your family because you're involved in sex work, right? So, you know, it took a major toll, because it's really difficult to hide what you do from people who you love, and also from, you know, people who you interact with in everyday life. So people had to separate audiences, separate their devices, separate like everything. And so some people who were engaging in sex work in one location, like they would go on tour and do all their sex work in one weekend, or you know, a week or two, make all the money they need to make, and then go back to their home community and go back to their square job. That was one population. But then there were folks who were, you know, working and living and doing sex work and square work in kind of the same vicinity, where you know, they would talk about just worried about being recognized by the wrong person at the wrong time. And so always trying to control how you're being read, what you're giving off. You don't want to say the wrong things, you know, and like, so that you don't give yourself away. And so, they're hiding sex work from square folks and square work from sex work industry folks. And it was quite a psychological and emotional, it took a toll on people. But then some found it quite, like, they are used to doing that. Like, so it wasn't a big thing. But others, it was like this Jekyll and Hyde thing, because, you know, if they were to be found out and outed, they would lose like everything. They would lose their job, family, relationships, prospects, future. They would lose absolutely everything. And for the folks that I highlighted in the book, they were like, most of them had university degrees, university educated, and they were trained for the square jobs that they held. So for them, because of the precarious labor market, they couldn't, you know, find livable wages, and they have to supplement to make ends meet. But they still want to work in those careers. Like they still want to maintain, you know, a square lifestyle and a square life while doing sex work on the side. So for them, if they were ever outed, they would lose it all.
It's a huge risk. Huge risk. So I thought that piece was really, really great to read about, and just so real too, because like, if they were to be outed, like, there goes your privacy, you can't open bank accounts, like, it's just really a really dangerous area to be in. So I thought that was a really good read. And and also, like, with going on the notion of like separation, I thought it was a cool piece to also read about the different rituals that people had. I thought that was really fun.
Have you done any of them? Because they had things like, especially the people who would work from home, like both square and sex work from home, some of them had a room where they would
Yeah.
contain their sex work and, light candles and
Yeah.
then all kinds of things, and then shut the door, and then that walk down the hallway was when they switched into their other personas and went into their private life or their square life. But there was one person who worked in her underwear because she was like doing her square job and her sex job at the same time. So it was like, oh my God, but that's like a life on standby. Like that is like, she's at the ready to do any job available anytime.
Totally.
So yeah, but they had some really neat things to kind of create that distance. Like once, the lights are off, the sheets are clean, the door is closed, that's it.
That's it, yeah. You turn that part off of you. Like, I can kind of relate to the participant that was working in their underwear, because, like, I work from home, so I'm just on my laptop doing my square job. But then I'll take a break and shoot some content, like, in between. Which is fun.
Yeah,
but
and people were doing that, even like folks who were also in school.
Mm-hmm.
So if they, went on tour and they would see clients, and in between clients they would do homework, and they would, like they're just these are just industrious sex workers are just industrious like folks that you just keeping themselves busy because there's as a sex worker there are so many there's so much downtime.
Yes, I was just gonna bring that up.
Doing anything in that.
Yes. It could be like a lot of, as you say, waiting around, and no one ever really talks about the mundane part of sex work, of the paperwork, of the stuff that you have to do on your computer, like all the posts that I have to write, the tweets that I have to schedule, or like photo editing or video editing. Like no one ever talks about that.
Work. And one of the participants talked to, because I was asking, because I kind of did a comparison of how much money people made in each type of work to kind of, and their rationales behind it. And there were only a couple of folks who were entrepreneurs who would talk about the downtime in sex work. Right. And that, by the time they're done in customer acquisition and nurturing the clients, dealing with all the admin, all that stuff, they were making 15 quid an hour. Like, but then when they get the kind of $200 an hour or 200, whatever it is an hour, they think, oh my God, that's great. But it's like, no, it took you 10 hours to make that 1 hour, right? So it's a lot of admin work and a lot of background work that people don't recognize. And as your last, the woman from Pace was talking about, it is that all those transferable skills. And all of that, ingenuity. And so there's a section on transferable skills here too, where people talk about all of the ways that each job in each industry job kind of informs each other and makes them better at both jobs. But then there's also the things that you can't celebrate because it's done in sex industries, for example, and you can't celebrate that or benefit from that in a square context, right? So there's also the downsides to that.
Absolutely. And another piece too, going back to what you said about like, oh, well, if you factor everything in, I'm only making X amount of money. And I also wanted to talk about like the anxiety that comes from gig work and from doing sex work. It's not always up here. It's a lot of ups and downs. Not every day is going to be the same. And I feel like we often don't talk about that either.
Yeah, like all the times you blanked. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's and that is the beauty of what people are doing here when they're innovating by living a dual life, because it's a boom and bust economy in sex industries. And I think one person talked about, a client popped up out of nowhere 6 months later. It's like, where have you been, right? Like, but it's like, hi, how's this going? And it's like, yeah, it's been like a year. But so in order to make sure that there's like a revenue stream still coming in, like, people who are solely in industries are doing all kinds of work and diversifying within industries. But these folks are also just diversifying outside of industries. So they have their square job, bread and butter job. Even though it's low pay for high time investment, it's still that regular check. And so they'll keep doing that. And then, at least sometimes some of their basic needs or most of their basic needs are paid. And then their industry work can supplement and can get them in the financial situation that they want to be in order to feel free, in order to take care of their kids, in order to, just have a better quality of life. So yeah, it is that, but the sad thing is when you're in like commission sales in your square job and sex industry, I wouldn't recommend that.
No.
Blending those two kinds of work, because it's going to be really unpredictable, and it's psychologically very difficult to plan a life when you don't know, where your money's coming from. You don't know, you can't plan ahead when you don't have any sort of income security or any idea of how much money you're going to bring in.
Yeah, it's really exhausting. It's very stressful. As someone that was like laid off during COVID, losing like all of my jobs, I'm like, okay, well now what am I going to do? And this is like a reality for many people. I mean, not just talking about COVID, but also like this is people's realities, like not knowing when the next client's going to come in, not knowing when the next paycheck's going to come in is a really scary feeling. And I'm glad that like a lot of the participants also touched on that too, because sometimes people just think sex workers, oh, you're just rolling in money.
Oh, you're rich.
Yeah.
There's a couple. I think there's a couple. Like I think there's a couple of participants that talked about that. Contributors. I think there's a male worker that talks about that. He was so frustrated by that people just thought, oh, he's a sex worker. He's got a lot of money. It's like, well, actually, no. Like I'm struggling like everybody else. I'm trying to get by like everyone else. So some of those old school myths, they're either like the really impoverished worker or the rich upper end, but it's like actually most workers are working class, middle class people, like totally trying to get by. And so I hope that if anything, this book expands who people think trade sex, and also brings some understanding between just understanding why people are living a dual life, why people engage in sex work, what's the logic behind it, what sacrifices they're making, and then also looking at our larger labor market, because we're creating precarity. We're creating these fragmented, underpaid jobs where nobody has health coverage, and all the costs of supporting workers are externalized, so we're not really employees, we're just workers, and like those kinds of things that the erosion of labor rights and collective bargaining and, all those things that make it so that your work is valued and you're compensated appropriately. We've eroded all of those things. Right. So it's no surprise that people are trying to do all kinds of gigging on the side to make a whole salary out of all these little pieces of jobs. It's no surprise. We're designing our work environment, our labor markets that way. And what's the end game? Like, we're all circling the drain here, right? Like, how long is this going to go on? Like, we have to decide about how we're going to redesign workplaces, how we're going to redesign our labor market so that we're actually paying people what they're worth.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that's even in industries, that's everywhere, right? Like, it's everywhere. It's just pay people what they're worth.
Yeah, like not just in sex industries, but like, for example, like I'm looking for another job right now too, and like I look at the wages and they're just so laughable, and just who can live off of this? I remember like receiving a contract and it was like $16 an hour, and nothing wrong with that, but that's not where I am at in my career. And it's just like, what is up with all these like lowballing efforts, and just like it's really, really, really frustrating.
Well, it's profits over people and over people's well-being, right? And it's just like, if as a capitalist, if I can cut corners and underpay my workers and overprice my goods, because if you talked about your COVID poverty and losing jobs, and then you think about how many millionaires and billionaires were produced through during
COVID.
The pandemic.
Yeah, I know, which is like ridiculous.
It's so stark that there are people who still can't have no food and still don't have stable work, and the variants are alive and well, and I guess we're all demasking and running about now. I don't know why, but like in the UK it's Freedom Day, I guess. So it's just like we have the Delta strain, it's a prominent strain, but I guess that doesn't matter. But we like it's absolute chaos, and so there has to be either promotion of a guaranteed livable income,
Yes.
where we know that nobody dips below the poverty line no matter what job you're doing.
Yes.
So that you're never desperate
Yes.
to, you know, when you're not, we're not going to be able to force people like to engage in forced labor or to exploit people. And so at least there's a baseline where we know that there's like dignity and there's a certain level of income and housing and health and education that every human being is entitled to.
Right.
And then it should matter less what people choose to do for their work, because they'll have choice and they'll have the right of refusal, and not you turning down your next date doesn't mean that you're homeless, right? Like, so, you know, we have to set up those conditions for freedom, liberation, workers' rights, choice, humanity, dignity, all of those things.
Absolutely. Well, you already answered my last question in terms of like, what do you hope readers will get from reading your book? You already went right into it. But did you want to add anything else to that?
There's like a long list of what I'd like to see, but yeah, that's part of it.
Well, before I let you go, like, where can we find, the book, and where can we find more information either about you or about NUM?
Sure. You can Google nationaluglymugs.org, and all of the projects and things that we're working on is available there. We have an announcements page that'll be up soon. It's not up now, but it'll show some of the research that we're doing in those activities. And then the book is available at policy.bristoluniversitypress.co.uk, and you'll link, it's a really long dashes, but you can Google Work, Money, and Duality, Trading Sex as a Side Hustle. And I hope more people read it. And, you know, it's like anything else. It's the sex working community will have a look at it. We'll take what's useful, we'll build on it, and we'll critique what they don't agree with. But I think it's a starting place for understanding the kinds of innovation and the diversity of sex workers, and how people are resisting poverty and resisting forms of oppression. And so, you know, all power to people in industries.
Amazing. And I actually have a question for you. Are you going to be writing another book in the future, or not?
Well, I have a couple papers in the cooker, but they're co-written pieces. I would be interested in a postdoc or partnering to do a larger research study on duality. Ideally, it would be a transnational study with the Canadian sample and a UK sample. It's been just an incredible, enlightening journey, learning from people and doing this kind of research. But what I will focus on in the future, not necessarily sex work and square work, but more about the work that people hide and the work that people are, because the sex work and square work continuum is, some people have really sexualized square jobs, and some people in sex industries don't consider their work sex industry, especially if you're doing admin and you're a booking girl or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily consider yourself a sex worker or in sex industries necessarily. But I'm more interested in the challenges around hiding work and why people do it and how they manage it. And some of the secret keeping and those kinds of things. So I'm interested in that a bit more.
Oh, that's super interesting. I can't wait to keep up with you and everything that you do, because your work is fascinating, and I'm so happy to have met you and to have connected with you. And I know this took a long time coming, and like let's reschedule. No, let's do this month, and but we're finally here. So thank you, Raven, so much for your time. Your book was excellent. I'm definitely going to be picking up a copy. And everyone else listening, it's new episodes every single Sunday. It is Stripped by Sia on Instagram, also Stripped by Sia on Twitter. Also, my personal Instagram is Sia Steph if you want to at me there. And we'll catch everyone in for another episode next Sunday. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You're listening to Stripped by Sia, hosted, produced, and edited by Steph Sia, artwork by Maria Bellandarama, music by Ted D, and photography by Ian Dabern.